Rufus Kane pointed at the frozen ground and laughed so hard his shoulders shook. "You're digging your own grave, girl." He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Loud enough that Caleb Morrow stepped out of the feed store just to watch. Loud enough that two ranch hands stopped their horses and grinned at the 18-year-old widow standing in the dirt with a pickaxe in her blistered hands and mud caked up to her elbows. Eliza Wren did not cry. She did not argue. She simply looked at Rufus Kane, this large, prosperous man with his silver belt buckle and his 500 cattle and his voice that filled every room it entered. And she went back to digging. That moment cost her nothing. It would cost him everything. If this story moves you, if you've ever been laughed at for doing what others couldn't understand, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The day Eliza Wren buried her husband, she wore her only black dress and stood alone at the gravesite because there was nobody left in her life to stand beside her. Thomas Wren had been 23 years old. He had died of a fever that came fast and left faster, taking him in 4 days from a man who could split a cord of wood before breakfast to a man who could no longer lift his own head off the pillow. Eliza had sat beside him through every one of those 4 days. She had wrung out cold cloths. She had talked to him even when he stopped answering. She had watched the exact moment when his breathing changed and then stopped. She was 18 years old. There was no family to send word to. Thomas had come west from Ohio with nothing but determination and a small amount of savings. And Eliza had come with him because she loved him and because staying behind in the Kentucky Hill Country meant spending the rest of her life in her stepfather's house. And that was a fate she had already decided she would not accept under any circumstances. So she had followed Thomas Wren to the frontier settlement of Hollow Flint, and together they had built a timber house on a rocky stretch of land northeast of town that nobody else had wanted because the limestone ridgeline made farming nearly impossible, and the nearest water source was a full quarter-mile down a steep slope. They had been happy anyway. They had been happy in a specific, uncomplicated way that Eliza had not expected. The happiness that comes from two people working side by side on something that belongs entirely to them. It was not a grand happiness. It was not romantic in any storybook sense. It was the happiness of a shared pot of coffee at dawn and a meal eaten together at dusk, and the knowledge that the land beneath your feet, whatever its faults, was your own. Thomas died on a Tuesday in early October. The bank arrived on a Friday. A man named Aldrich came from the Hollow Flint Territorial Savings Association, which was a very long name for a very small operation run by a very impatient creditor, and he informed Eliza that the remaining balance on the timber house and the property deed transfer were both past due and had been past due for several months, which Thomas had apparently known and had apparently not told her, perhaps because he thought he would find a way to manage it, or perhaps because he was the kind of man who believed that problems announced too early only grew larger in the telling. Aldrich was not unkind, exactly. He was simply the kind of man who had made his peace with delivering difficult news by delivering it very quickly and then leaving before the full weight of it landed. "You have 2 weeks to settle or vacate," he said. Then he rode back toward town. Eliza stood on the porch of the timber house for a long time after he disappeared down the trail. 2 weeks. She had 14 days, approximately $40 in a tin box under the floorboards, no livestock except a bad-tempered mule that Thomas had borrowed from a neighbor and never returned, and a piece of land that even its original surveyors had described in the official county record as marginal, rocky, largely unsuitable. She had no parents to return to. She had no siblings close enough to reach before winter. She had no marketable skills beyond what any frontier woman learned by necessity: cooking, preserving, basic carpentry, animal care, the ability to work without stopping until the work was done. What she did have was the rocky land itself. The bank wanted the timber house, but the land deed, as it turned out, had a separate legal structure that Aldrich had glossed over in his rapid departure. And when Eliza rode into town and spent 45 minutes in the office of the settlement's only part-time legal clerk, she discovered that the 40 acres of Limestone Ridge were technically hers outright, purchased separately and paid in full the previous spring. Nobody wanted 40 acres of Limestone Ridge. That was apparently why Thomas had been able to pay for it outright. So Eliza moved out of the timber house 12 days later, carrying everything she owned in a borrowed handcart, and she walked up to the rocky ridge above the settlement with 40 acres of nearly worthless land and $31 remaining in her tin box, and began to think very carefully about how to survive a frontier winter with almost nothing. The problem was immediate and practical. She needed shelter. She could not afford to build anything of substance. Lumber was expensive. Hauling materials up the limestone ridge would require a horse team she did not have. Even a basic sod house required flat land and the right kind of earth, and the ridge gave her neither. She stood on the slope for a long time. The wind came across the ridge from the north, and it was the kind of wind that found every gap in every garment and settled there, cold and patient. She turned around to face into it and then turned back, and she looked at the long slope of the ridge, and she thought about the time she and Thomas had dug the root cellar behind the timber house, how the air inside had been different, still and moderate, neither the killing cold of February nor the brutal heat of August. And she thought about what she actually understood about how the earth held temperature. She did not think about what people would say. That part came later. She started digging on a Wednesday morning with a pickaxe she had purchased for $3 from Caleb Morrow's hardware supply, a broken wheelbarrow she had found abandoned behind the old livery, and no plan beyond the basic geological logic she had worked out on her own. 6 feet of earth overhead meant stable temperature. It meant the freeze could not reach her. It meant that what she dug would hold whatever warmth was put inside it. The limestone was hard. The first day she made approximately 3 feet of progress, and she went to sleep that night with her hands so stiff she could barely open her fingers. She soaked them in warm water and wrapped them in rags and lay on the ground beside her small fire and did not sleep well, and woke the next morning and went back to digging. That was when Rufus Kane first saw her. He was riding the ridge road on his way to check the north pasture fence line. Rufus Kane rode that road 3 or 4 times a week because his property abutted the north side of Hollow Flint's grazing commons, and he liked to keep track of what happened along its edges. And he pulled up his horse at the sight of the young woman with the pickaxe attacking the side of the limestone ridge like it had personally offended her. "What in the devil are you doing?" he asked. Eliza looked up at him. Rufus Kane was a substantial man in every way. Large frame, large voice, large presence. The kind of man who had made enough money in cattle to believe that the way he saw things was probably the way things were. He had wide hands and a thick gray mustache, and he wore a hat that cost more than Eliza's entire remaining savings. "Building a house," she said. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has encountered something so far outside his understanding that laughter is genuinely the first response his body produces. "Underground?" he said. "The limestone will hold," Eliza said. 6 feet overhead. Cedar posts for the ceiling supports. I can keep a stable temperature all winter." Rufus Kane looked at the hole in the hillside. He looked at Eliza's hands. He looked at the broken wheelbarrow and the pickaxe and the dirt piled at the entrance. "Young woman," he said, with what he seemed to believe was genuine helpfulness, "that is a grave. You are digging a grave." "Then I'll be very comfortable in it," Eliza said, and went back to work. He laughed again, louder this time, and rode on down the ridge road. Word traveled the way word traveled in small frontier settlements, which was to say it traveled faster than anything else, and with considerable embellishment. By that evening, Caleb Morrow had heard the story from Rufus himself, standing at the counter of the feed store and demonstrating with his large hands the approximate size of the hole the widow Wren had started in the limestone ridge. "She told me she was building a house," Rufus said, "underground, like a badger." Caleb Morrow was a tall, narrow man with a precise manner and a tendency to measure his words carefully before releasing them. He had been in Hollow Flint for 11 years, and he had watched enough settlers fail and enough settlers survive to have developed a modest but genuine respect for unconventional thinking. But he looked at Rufus across the counter, and he shook his head slowly. "She'll freeze," Caleb said, "even underground if it gets cold enough. And it gets cold enough, she won't have the heating capacity. A wood stove underground in a sealed space is a different problem than a wood stove in a house with windows." "I told her it was a grave," Rufus said. "What did she say?" "She said she'd be comfortable in it." Caleb thought about that. "I'll check on her in a few days," he said. He did not go for 2 weeks, and by the time he did, the shelter was already 12 feet deep, and Eliza was reinforcing the ceiling with cedar posts she had cut from the slope below the ridge and hauled up on the broken wheelbarrow, one at a time, each trip taking the better part of 20 minutes. He stood at the entrance and looked in. The air inside was noticeably different, calmer, warmer than the outside, which was already showing the bite of late October. "You've been working fast," he said. "I've been working every day," Eliza said, from somewhere deeper in the shelter, where she was fitting a post against the ceiling. "There's a difference." "The temperature will still drop," Caleb said, "even with the earth insulating you. When it gets to 20 below, even the ground surface loses heat. You'll need a heating source." "I'm aware," Eliza said. "Most people use a stove." "I know what most people use." "What are you planning?" There was a pause. Then Eliza came toward the entrance and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostility, exactly, but the look of someone who has already had this conversation with themselves and arrived at a conclusion and is not entirely eager to share it because sharing it means hearing it said out loud. "Goats," she said. Caleb blinked. "I'm sorry?" 12 goats, Eliza said. "I can get them from the Harmon place. Old Harmon's wife died last spring and he's been trying to get rid of the herd since August. Nobody wants them because they're a mixed breed. Not good enough dairy stock and not worth slaughtering. I can get 12 animals for about $25. Caleb Morrow looked at her. He was a careful man and he was working through the logic, and he had to admit, standing there at the entrance to the limestone shelter with the October wind at his back, that there was a logic there. Livestock heat was a known quantity. Farm families had been surviving cold winters in proximity to their animals for generations. Underground, the heat would not dissipate the way it did in an open barn. "That leaves you almost nothing," he said. "You'll have $6. "I know. If anything goes wrong, if an animal gets sick, if you need supplies you haven't accounted for—" "I know," Eliza said again, and her voice carried the particular edge of someone who has already sat alone with all the ways a plan can fail and has decided that the alternative is worse. "I've thought about it." Caleb looked at the shelter again. He thought about the feed store roof that he had been meaning to reinforce since last spring. He thought about the 3 families he had seen lose everything in hard winters over the past decade. "I'll give you a 20-pound bag of grain on credit," he said, "for the goats." Eliza looked at him for a moment. Something in her face changed. Not much, just briefly, the way exhausted people sometimes look when something unexpected turns out to be kind. "Thank you," she said. "I'll pay it back in milk." She went back to Harmon's place the next morning and came back that afternoon with 12 goats on a lead rope, walking them up the ridge road, while Rufus Kane watched from his fence line with his arms crossed and a look on his face that he would later have difficulty explaining. He shouted across to her. "Those animals aren't worth the feed you'll put into them," he said. Eliza didn't stop walking. "Then you won't mind that I have them," she said over her shoulder. She brought the goats inside the shelter at dusk. The ceiling was finished, the cedar posts were set, the dirt floor was packed, and she had cut a ventilation shaft up through 6 feet of earth to the surface with an iron pipe she had found rusting behind the old livery. The ventilation shaft was the part she was least sure about. The pipe was narrow, barely 3 inches across, and she did not know for certain that it would be sufficient, but she had calculated the cubic footage of the shelter and estimated the breathing requirements of 12 goats and 1 person and decided that it was probably enough. Probably. She kept that particular uncertainty to herself. The first night with the goats inside, the thermometer she had hung from the ceiling post read 53 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 28. Eliza sat on the dirt floor with her back against the limestone wall, and 12 warm animals settling around her and the lantern burning low. And she thought about Thomas, the way she did every evening before sleep, and she thought about what he would have said if he could have seen this particular moment. He would have laughed, she decided. Not the way Rufus Kane laughed, not the dismissal and the spectacle of it, but the specific laugh Thomas had for moments when life turned strange in directions neither of them had predicted. He had laughed that way when the mule kicked over their water barrel on moving day and flooded the entire back of the wagon. He had laughed that way the first time they lost power to a windstorm and sat eating cold beans by candlelight and pretended it was a fancy dinner. He would have laughed, and then he would have leaned over and put his arm around her, and that was the part she couldn't reconstruct any longer, could not make herself feel even in imagination, the specific weight and warmth of his arm. She pulled her coat tighter. One of the goats, A small tan one with a broken horn that she had started thinking of privately as stubborn, because it was, pressed its broad forehead against her knee and stood there. Eliza put her hand on its head. 53 degrees. Outside, 28. She had been right. The question was whether she would still be right when the real winter came. And the real winter in this part of the frontier was not the gentle December cold that eased in gradually and allowed time for adjustment. The real winter here came as if it had somewhere to be, with velocity and temperature that could kill an exposed animal in hours and strip the warmth from an uninsulated building in less time than that. She had survived the first night. November was still ahead of her. And somewhere in the northern sky, already building itself in the jet stream above the mountains, something enormous was gathering. Something that would make every careful choice Eliza Wren had made. Every blister and every mock decision and every sleepless calculation, the most important work she had ever done in her 18 years of life. She didn't know that yet. She blew out the lantern. The goats breathed around her in the dark. The thermometer held at 53. November came in like it was already angry. The first week brought nothing dramatic, just the kind of cold that settled into everything slowly, the way water finds its way into the lowest point of a field. The ground hardened. The creek that ran along the base of the ridge developed a thin skin of ice by morning that melted by afternoon, then a thicker skin that didn't melt, then ice solid enough that Eliza had to take a hatchet to it every morning to get water for the goats. The sky turned the particular shade of gray that had no bottom to it, the kind of gray that wasn't a color so much as an absence of one. Eliza had developed a routine by then, and routine was what kept her functional in the way that emotion alone could not. She rose before light, which arrived later each day, and left earlier, so that the window of actual daylight was shrinking the way everything in November shrinks, reluctantly and without apology. She fed the goats from the dried grass she had cut and bundled in October, stacking it against the south-facing wall of the shelter in bales she had compressed and tied with rope. She milked the three does that were producing. Stubborn among them, the broken-horned one who had started the whole personal naming habit by pressing her head against Eliza's knee on the first night, and she stored the milk in the tin containers she had bought from Caleb Morrow's store on credit, added to the grain bill that was already sitting in his ledger under her name. She ate sparingly. This was not a choice born of discipline so much as arithmetic. $31 minus $25 for the goats, minus $3 for the pickaxe minus what she owed. Caleb put her in a position where every purchase had to justify itself against the alternative of not eating that particular thing at all. She had flour, dried apples, salt, a small quantity of cornmeal, and enough lamp oil for approximately 6 weeks if she was careful about it. She was careful about it. The loneliness was the thing she hadn't calculated for. She had thought about temperature. She had thought about food supply and water access and ventilation and structural integrity and the heating math of 12 goat bodies in an enclosed space. She had not thought about the specific quality of silence that fills a limestone chamber when you are alone in it, and the way that silence has a texture after enough days that it starts to feel like a presence rather than an absence. She started talking to the goats, not in the baby voice way that some people talk to animals, but in the ordinary way she would have talked to Thomas, narrating small decisions, working through problems out loud, saying things like, "I think we need to move the hay bales to the east wall before the next cold snap, because the west wall is already showing moisture." And waiting, fully aware that the response would be a blank stare from Stubborn, or the sound of one of the larger bucks shifting its weight and knocking into the cedar post. She was not confused about what the goats were. She was simply filling the silence with the sound of her own thinking, which at least confirmed she was still capable of it. It was during one of these one-sided conversations, around the second week of November, that she first noticed the sky. She had climbed out of the shelter to check the ventilation pipe, a daily task that had become as automatic as the milking, and she stood on the ridge and looked north, the way she did every morning, and she saw something that stopped her mid-sentence about hay bale placement. The northern horizon had changed. It was not a storm yet. It was not even a cloud formation, not exactly. It was a quality of the light, or the absence of it, a darkness pressed against the far edge of the sky that was not the ordinary darkness of distance. She had grown up in the Kentucky hill country, and she had seen weather come in from the north before, had watched her stepfather's face when he stood on the porch, and looked at that particular shade and that particular pressure in the air, and she remembered what he did after he looked at it. He went inside and started counting supplies. She went back underground and started counting supplies. What she found was that she had enough grain for the goats for approximately 3 weeks, enough human food for about the same, enough lamp oil for 5 weeks, and a ventilation shaft that was functioning well but had not been tested under serious snowfall. The pipe was iron, 3 inches across, and it emerged at the surface inside a small ring of stones she had built to keep the immediate area around it clear. In moderate snow, the ring of stones would hold. In serious snow, the kind that built up 2 and 3 feet overnight, she wasn't sure. She cut an extra pole from the cedar stand below the ridge, 7 feet long, with one end sharpened, so that if the shaft blocked, she could push it clear from inside. She leaned it against the wall next to the ladder. She used to reach the shaft opening, and she told herself it was probably a precaution she wouldn't need. She believed herself about 50% of the time. 3 days after she noticed the sky, she rode the borrowed mule into Hollow Flint. She had 2 reasons. She needed to add to the grain supply before whatever was coming made the ride impossible, and she needed, though she would not have used this word, to see other people, to hear voices that answered back, to stand in a building that had walls instead of earth, and remember that the ordinary world still existed beyond the ridge. Caleb Morrow's feed store was warm in the particular way of buildings that have functioned long enough to absorb the life happening inside them. It smelled of grain and leather and the wood smoke from the iron stove in the corner, and there were 3 men standing near the stove when Eliza came in, Caleb himself behind the counter, and 2 ranchers whose names she knew, but who had never had occasion to speak to her directly. They looked at her the way the town had been looking at her for 6 weeks, which was the look of people who had committed to a fixed opinion and were waiting for reality to confirm it. Eliza went to the counter. "I need to add 50 pounds of mixed grain to my account," she said, "and another 10 pounds of cornmeal if you have it." "I have it," Caleb said. He was already moving, which was the thing she appreciated about him. He didn't have a lot of opinions about what she was doing. He just kept the ledger straight and did the work. "Storm coming?" she asked, low enough that the men by the stove might not hear. Caleb glanced at her. "Probably." "How bad?" He paused for a moment with his hand on the grain bin. "I've been watching the pattern since last week. The temperature drop is unusual for November. Usually we don't see this kind of cold until January." He kept his voice level. "I've been reinforcing the feed store roof, just to be prepared." She nodded. One of the men by the stove, a rancher named Decker, who had a spread about 2 miles south of Rufus Kane's property, spoke without turning around. "You still living in that hole in the ground?" he asked. "Still living," Eliza said. The other man chuckled. Decker said something else that she didn't catch because she had stopped listening, which was a skill she had developed early and used often. She loaded the grain onto the mule's back and was tying the rope when Rufus Kane came out of the side door of the building next door, the small office space that served as Hollow Flint's informal livestock exchange, where ranchers posted prices and buyers came to negotiate, and nearly walked into her. He stopped. She stopped. The mule pinned its ears back in the general way it expressed opinions about everything. "You buying supplies?" Rufus asked. "Yes." "Good idea," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite what she expected. It was not the easy mockery from the ridge road. He sounded, if anything, like a man who was also buying supplies and did not entirely want to admit it. "Storm's probably coming." "That's what I heard." He looked at the bags on the mule. "How many animals do you have?" 12. "All goats?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the loaded mule, and she could see him doing something like mental arithmetic and not entirely liking where it came out. Then he said, "I've got 480 head of cattle in the north pasture." "I know," Eliza said. "Open pasture. Good fence, good water supply, standard winter setup." He said it the way a man says something he has always believed and is now, for the first time, examining from the outside. "I've done 6 winters with that setup. Never lost more than a handful." 6 winters, Eliza said. "Yeah." She looked at him directly. She did not want to say what she was about to say, not because she was afraid of him. She had stopped being afraid of Rufus Kane around the 3rd day of digging when she realized that his opinion of her survival was not actually relevant to her survival, but because she had enough of her stepfather in her history to know how men like Rufus Kane received advice from women who were young and plus size, and recently widowed and digging holes in the ground. But she said it anyway. "If those cattle are in open pasture when this storm comes in, and it's what I think it is," she said, "you won't lose a handful." Rufus looked at her. "You'll lose most of them," she said. The silence between them lasted long enough that the mule shifted its weight and the grain bags creaked. "You're 18 years old," Rufus said. Not unkindly, just stating what he believed to be the relevant fact. "Yes," Eliza said, "and I'm telling you to move your cattle before the temperature drops below 10 degrees. After that, the decision gets made for you." She untied the mule's lead from the post and started walking back toward the ridge road. Rufus stood where he was. She did not look back. He did not move his cattle. She found out 3 days later from a boy named Eddie Marsh, who ran errands for the feed store and occasionally rode past her ridge on his way to his family's claim further east. Eddie was 15 and had the kind of face that showed everything he was thinking in real time, which made him a useful source of information about the town, even when he wasn't trying to provide any. "Mr. Kane says the storm talk is overblown," Eddie told her, pulling up on his small gray horse at the entrance to her shelter. "He says he's seen people panic over weather before and lose money moving stock they didn't need to move." "Did he say anything else?" Eliza asked. "He said—" Eddie stopped. He had the look of a boy who had been asked to repeat something he knew was going to land badly. "Go on," Eliza said. "He said you were a young widow with a head full of bad ideas and that the settlement had enough to worry about without taking livestock advice from someone who kept goats underground." Eliza was quiet. "He didn't mean it mean," Eddie offered. "He meant it exactly as mean as it sounded," Eliza said, without heat in her voice. "It's all right, Eddie. He's entitled to his opinion." She gave the boy a cup of goat milk, which he drank with the particular gratitude of someone who hadn't had anything warm in a while, and he rode on east, and Eliza went back inside the shelter and sat with her back against the limestone wall and looked at the thermometer. 58 degrees inside, 14 degrees outside. She thought about Rufus Kane's 480 cattle in the open north pasture, and she thought about the northern sky and the metallic quality the wind had been carrying for 2 days, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was fear, not for herself, but the specific helpless fear of watching something preventable happening and being unable to stop it. She thought about going back to town, about saying it again more directly, to Rufus or to the town council or to anyone who would listen. Then she thought about the look on Rufus Kane's face when he had said she was a young widow with a head full of bad ideas. She went back to checking the ventilation shaft instead. That night was the coldest yet. The thermometer outside, which she had mounted on a post at the shelter entrance, read 8 degrees by midnight. Instito, with 12 goats breathing and shifting in the enclosed space, she held at 56. She lay on her bedroll and listened to the wind and thought about the structure of the shelter. The cedar posts, the limestone ceiling, the packed dirt walls, and went through it all in her mind the way she had gone through it 100 times, looking for the weakness she had missed, the flaw in the reasoning that would make the whole thing collapse. She fell asleep still looking. The goats were calm. That was something. Animals knew things about incoming weather in ways that human beings had mostly stopped knowing, and the fact that the herd had been restless and vocal the previous week but had quieted in the past 2 days told her something she couldn't quite articulate, but trusted. She woke at 3 in the morning. The shelter was very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of sleeping animals, something different, a depth of quiet that felt like the world outside had changed its nature. She climbed the ladder to the ventilation shaft and pushed her arm up through it and felt what was there. Snow. Not falling. Already fallen. Already 6 inches deep around the pipe opening and still coming down. She pushed it clear and came back down and sat in the lantern light and listened to the sound of the storm that she had not heard yet because 6 feet of earth was doing exactly what she had calculated it would do, which was to insulate her completely from the sound and fury happening above her. Outside it was happening. She did not know yet how bad it was. She would not know for some time. What she knew was that the temperature in the shelter had dropped 2 degrees since she had gone to sleep, now 54. And that the goats were awake and pressed together in the center of the space, and that Stubborn had moved to stand directly behind Eliza's left leg, the way she did when something bothered her. "I know," Eliza said quietly. She added the last of the dried grass to the feeding area and watched the goats eat and counted them the way she always did, 1 through 12, naming them in the order she'd named them, stubborn first. And they were all there, all standing, all eating, and she exhaled slowly. She did not sleep again. By the time wheat-gray light began to filter down through the ventilation shaft, which told her it was approximately dawn, or what dawn looked like through that much snow cloud, she had pushed the shaft clear twice more, each time pulling her arm back in with a sleeve caked in ice that she shook off over the dirt floor. The pipe was holding, but the accumulation rate was higher than she had planned for. If the storm ran more than another 12 hours, she would need to use the pole. She ate a small bowl of cornmeal with a cup of goat milk, sitting on the dirt floor with Stubborn's head pressed against her knee, and she thought about Hollow Flint, 2 miles south and downhill, and the wooden buildings there with their wooden walls and their windows that the wind could find. She thought about Caleb Morrow reinforcing the feed store roof. She thought about whether he had finished in time. She thought about Rufus Kane, and then she stopped thinking about any of them, because the lantern was burning lower than she had calculated it should be. She had been burning it more hours than planned during the sleepless night. And she needed to think about lamp oil, not about people who had made their choices without her. She trimmed the wick and lowered the flame to the minimum that still gave useful light and sat in the near-dark shelter with 12 breathing animals in a storm she could not see or hear happening above her. And she did what she had been doing since October. She thought through the problem in front of her. Lamp oil. Approximately 4 weeks remaining at current burn rate, but she had increased the burn rate, so call it 3 weeks. Acceptable, if the storm passed quickly. Food. Enough flour for 2 weeks of flatbread, cornmeal for another week, dried apples for 2 weeks, salt adequate. Water. The stored containers were full, 20 gallons, enough for the goats and herself for approximately 10 days. After that, she would need surface access, which depended on the storm ending, which she had no information about. She went through the shelter's structural integrity again, running her hands along the cedar posts the way she had done every day, checking for movement. The limestone above her was stable. She had been right about that, the kind of geological certainty that did not change with weather. And the posts were set correctly. No loosening, no creak. She was in the middle of checking the third post when something hit the door. Not the storm. The storm couldn't get to the door. The entrance tunnel was angled, specifically designed to prevent direct wind pressure on the door itself, something she had figured out through basic reasoning after thinking about how root cellars were traditionally built. Something hit the door. Something with weight and specificity. Not a branch, not debris. Something that hit the door and then stayed against it. She stood in the middle of the shelter looking at the heavy wooden door she had built from the lumber salvaged from the old timber house before the bank took it. 3 planks thick, iron-hinged, weighted at the bottom. And she thought about the heat inside the shelter, 53 degrees, hard-won and irreplaceable. And she thought about opening the door. The cold that would come in with that door open would drop the shelter temperature by 10 degrees in the first 60 seconds and cost her the better part of an hour of animal warmth to recover. In a storm of this size, with the ventilation already working harder than planned, that was not a trivial calculation. She crossed the shelter in 3 steps and lifted the iron bar from the door. The wind hit her the moment it opened, even in the angled tunnel, the cold driving through the gap like something physical, and she saw Caleb Morrow on his knees on the tunnel floor, both hands pressed against the dirt, his coat entirely white with snow and ice, his hat gone somewhere in the blizzard, and his face the gray-white color of a man whose body has been deciding between survival and failure for longer than he knew. "Caleb," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were working but slowly, the way eyes work when the blood has been pulled from the extremities to protect the core. "There's someone," he said. His voice was wrong, thin and compressed. "Behind me. Rufus." She looked past him into the tunnel entrance. A second shape was wedged against the tunnel wall, larger than Caleb, not moving in any purposeful way, moving the way things move when they are being moved by the wind rather than by their own intention. Eliza braced her feet and reached past Caleb and grabbed the front of Rufus Kane's coat with both hands and pulled. He was heavy. He was a large man and he was wearing a coat that had absorbed snow and ice for however long he had been outside, and pulling him was like pulling wet timber, no cooperation from the body being moved, just dead resistance and the raw physics of it. Her back screamed. Her boots slipped on the tunnel floor. She set her teeth and pulled again, harder, and Caleb, recovering something, some reserve, pushed from behind, and together they got Rufus Kane through the door. She dropped the iron bar back into its bracket. The door sealed. The wind stopped. She stood in the shelter, breathing hard, looking at two men on her floor, Caleb sitting up against the wall trying to work his fingers, and Rufus Kane on his back, ice in his mustache, eyes open and blinking at the cedar posts above him. And then she turned and went to the small pot she kept on the iron trivet and poured the goat milk she had heated that morning into the cup and brought it to Caleb first because he was closest, and she could see his hands better, and hands that color needed warmth from inside before anything else would help. "Drink this," she said. He drank it without argument. She refilled the cup and brought it to Rufus, and he started to say something, and she said, "Drink it first," and he looked at her for a moment with a complicated expression and then drank. The goats had moved to the far side of the shelter when the door opened, which was their habit when anything unexpected happened. But now they were coming back slowly, the way goats move when curiosity overrides caution, and stubborn, because of course it was stubborn, came directly to where Rufus Kane was lying on the floor and stood over him and looked at his face with the blank, earnest attention of an animal that has no opinion but wants to be involved. Rufus stared up at the goat. "That's stubborn," Eliza said. "She's curious. She won't bite." Rufus said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the ceiling, at the cedar posts, at the thermometer on the wall. He was breathing in the air of the shelter the way people breathe when they have been outside long enough that ordinary temperature feels like luxury. "The roof," he finally said. "Which roof?" Eliza said. "Caleb's feed store. The new section we reinforced." He stopped, swallowed. "The old section went first. Wind caught it at the north corner and peeled it back." He paused again. "We were inside when it started. We ran south toward your ridge because it was the only—" He stopped again. Eliza waited. "Because it was the only shelter I could think of," Rufus Kane said, "that I knew for certain was still standing." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ceiling. "How bad is it out there?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Bad," he said. "Very bad." Caleb had gotten his hands working enough to wrap them around the empty cup. He looked at Eliza across the lantern light, and she could see that he was thinking the same thing she was thinking, which was about the rest of Hollow Flint. The families in the wooden houses, the building with the thin walls, the children, the old people, and what the storm was doing to all of it right now, above their heads, in the world, above the 6 feet of limestone and earth that was keeping the 3 of them and 12 goats alive. "How long were you outside?" Eliza asked. "I don't know," Caleb said. "An hour, maybe more. We lost the lantern in the first 10 minutes, and after that I was navigating by the shape of the ridge." He exhaled slowly. "I almost missed it. I almost went past the entrance." "What stopped you?" He thought about it. "The stone ring around the ventilation pipe. I saw it when the wind shifted for a second. I knew what it was." She nodded. She went back to the ventilation shaft and checked it. Still clear? Barely. She got the long pole and pushed it up through the opening to create more clearance above, feeling the resistance of heavy snow and ice, pushing until it broke through and then pulling the pole back down with ice crystals falling around her hands. When she came down from the ladder, both men were watching her. She didn't explain what she had done. She just went back to the fire trivet and put more milk on to heat and sat down on the dirt floor and pulled her coat around her shoulders and looked at the thermometer. 51 degrees, down from 53. The door opening had cost her exactly what she had calculated, and the recovery was happening, but slowly, because the 3 additional bodies in the shelter were offset by the cold that had come in with them and the additional drain on the air supply that 3 extra lungs represented. She looked at the ventilation pipe. She looked at the lamp, burning low. She looked at Caleb and Rufus, both sitting against the limestone wall with their coats dripping slow dark circles onto the dirt floor. "The storm is going to get worse before it gets better," she said. Not to either of them specifically, just to the air of the shelter, which was at 51 degrees and dropping, and which was, right now, the only thing between all of them and the catastrophe happening above. Rufus looked at the goats pressed warm against each other in the center of the space. He looked at the thermometer. He said nothing. But the mockery was completely gone from his face, and Eliza noticed, and she registered it, and she set it aside because the ventilation shaft needed checking again in approximately 40 minutes, and the lamp oil needed rationing, and the goats needed their evening feeding, and the storm wasn't done and they were not safe yet, none of them, not by a distance she was comfortable with. Stubborn pushed against Rufus Kane's knee. He looked down at the goat. Very slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose hands were still not entirely under his own authority, he reached down and put his palm on the animal's head. The shelter held at 51 degrees. The storm pressed down from above, and Eliza Wren sat on the dirt floor of the home she had dug out of a limestone ridge with a borrowed pickaxe and a broken wheelbarrow, with 12 goats and 2 men who had laughed at her, and she watched the thermometer and kept the lamp burning and pushed the ventilation shaft clear when it needed clearing, and she did not think about whether she had been right or whether they had been wrong. She thought about the air, about the temperature, about the things that actually mattered. Outside, the blizzard of 1895 was doing everything it intended to do. Inside, the thermometer climbed back to 53. The thermometer climbed back to 53 and stayed there, which was the best news Eliza had received in 2 days, and she treated it with the same caution she treated all good news, which was to note it, be grateful for it, and immediately start thinking about what could still go wrong. What could still go wrong was considerable. The lamp oil was the immediate problem. She had burned through more than she had planned in the sleepless hours before Caleb and Rufus arrived, and now she had 3 people in a lantern that needed to stay lit, because without light in a sealed underground chamber, the darkness was the absolute kind, not the partial dark of a moonless night outside where your eyes eventually adjust, but the zero-light dark of a space with no windows and no ambient anything, the kind of dark that does specific things to people's minds after enough hours of it. She rationed the flame down to the minimum she could manage and still see the thermometer clearly, and she positioned the lantern so that its light reached the far wall where the goats were gathered because the goats needed to be visible. If one of them went down in the dark and she didn't know about it, the body heat equation changed before she could compensate. Rufus had recovered enough by the second hour to sit up properly. His hands were working again. She could tell because he kept opening and closing them in the way people do when sensation returns to fingers that have been too cold, testing each one like he was counting them. He hadn't said much since the thing about the shelter being the only one he could think of that was still standing. He sat against the limestone wall with Stubborn's warm flank pressed against his leg, and he watched Eliza work and did not offer to help, and did not offer opinions, which was such a departure from everything she knew about Rufus Kane that it was almost unsettling. Caleb had gone to sleep. This was not weakness, it was intelligence. His body needed heat and rest to finish recovering, and sleep was the most efficient way to do both. And Eliza had given him her bedroll, which meant she was sitting on the dirt floor with only her coat between her and the packed earth, which was fine. The floor held its temperature. The earth that people thought of as cold was not cold at this depth. It was stable, and stable was a word she had come to love the way other people loved words like warm or safe. She was checking the ventilation shaft, her 3rd time in 6 hours, the accumulation rate still climbing, when Rufus finally spoke. "How much oil do you have left?" he asked. She came down the ladder with ice on her sleeve. "Enough," she said. That wasn't an answer. She looked at him. 3 weeks, maybe, if I keep it at this level. And food? Enough for all 3 of us for about a week and a half. Maybe 2 if we're careful. We being me and Caleb now too, he said. That's the math, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have moved the cattle. She sat down on the floor across from him, her back to the limestone wall, and she looked at him directly. Yes. I've done 6 winters here, he said. 480 head. Never lost significant numbers. That becomes a kind of... He stopped. You start to think the thing that's worked before will keep working. Most of the time it does, Eliza said. That's why it's hard to plan for when it doesn't. He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Something tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I told people you were digging your own grave, he said. I know, Eddie Marsh told me. Rufus looked at his hands. That was a stupid thing to say. It was, she agreed. He almost smiled at that. Not quite. You're not going to tell me it's all right, he said. No, she said. I'm not going to do that. He nodded, like that was the right answer. Then he reached down and put his hand on Stubborn's back, and the goat leaned into it slightly without looking up. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was different from the silence of the previous weeks. the empty silence of the chamber before they arrived. This was the silence of people who had run out of the easy things to say and hadn't decided yet whether to go further. Caleb was snoring slightly. One of the bucks, the big gray one at the back of the herd that she had named, privately and without much imagination, Gray, had lain down, which meant the others would follow in the next hour. And lying animals generated different heat than standing ones, distributed differently through the space, which meant the thermometer might shift by a degree or two, and she needed to account for that. She got up and checked the thermometer, 52.5. She adjusted her mental model and sat back down. "My wife," Rufus said, out of nowhere. She looked at him. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever. Like your husband." He paused. 3 days for her. Fast." Eliza said nothing. She waited. "After she was gone, I put everything into the cattle," he said. "Everything I had. Every hour. Because if you're working that hard, you don't have to—" He stopped again. He seemed to do this on purpose, stop at the edge of things and stand there, deciding. "You don't have to think about it as much." "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her. "How old are you really? You seem, I don't know, you seem older than 18. "I'm 18, she said. "I've just had a busy year." That one he did smile at, small and brief, but real. "The cattle," he started. "Don't think about it tonight," she said. "There's nothing you can do about it tonight." "I know, but I can't stop." "I know you can't stop thinking about it," she said. "But thinking about it won't change what's happening out there. And you need to stay warm, and your body needs to stop burning energy on worry when it should be using it to finish recovering from the cold." She paused. "Try to sleep." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're telling me what to do." "Someone has to," she said evenly. "You're in my house." This time he actually laughed, soft and short, and it changed his whole face for a moment, made him look like a different man, or maybe the same man from some earlier time before the cattle empire, and the silver belt buckle and the public voice that filled every room. He leaned his head back against the limestone wall. In 20 minutes, he was asleep. Eliza sat alone with the lantern and the goats and the thermometer and the knowledge that the storm above them was doing everything it had announced it would do. And she went through her supply calculations again and found them adequate, which was the best she could say. And then she climbed the ladder and pushed the ventilation shaft clear for the 4th time, and felt the resistance above the pipe and registered that the snow was now deep enough that the ring of stones she had built around the opening was completely buried, and she made a note of that and came back down. She let herself close her eyes for a few minutes, just a few, sitting with her back against the wall in the warmth of 12 goats and 2 sleeping men in the enclosed space. And she thought about Thomas again, the way she did. And this time what she thought about was practical. What he would have thought about the ventilation shaft. He had been good with engineering problems, better than her in that specific way, could look at a mechanical puzzle and find the weak point faster than she could. He would have looked at the shaft and told her the pipe diameter was marginal, and she should have gone to 4 inches instead of 3. She would have argued with him. They would have settled on something in the middle. She opened her eyes. The lantern flame was steady. The shelter was 52 degrees. Everyone was breathing. She got the long pole and stood at the base of the ladder and measured it mentally against the depth of snow she had felt above the pipe. And she thought the pole would still be sufficient, but there was a number, a snow depth number, beyond which the pole would not be enough, and she would have to go outside to clear it, which meant opening the door and climbing out into the storm, which was a different category of problem entirely. She did not want to think about that yet. She went back to the supply count instead. The second day passed in a rhythm that was partly practical and partly something else, something that she didn't have a clean word for. The strange intimacy of confined space, of people who would never have chosen each other's company. Discovering that company itself, in the right circumstances, becomes the thing that matters most regardless of who is providing it. Rufus woke in the early afternoon and ate the flatbread Eliza had made on the trivet with the careful economy of someone who understood now, without being told, that the portions were not going to get larger. He helped with the goats without being asked, refilling the hay at the feeding area, moving the water container, doing the small tasks of animal husbandry with the competence of a man who had worked with livestock his whole life, even if the animals in question were 12 goats rather than 480 cattle. He did not comment on the difference. Caleb woke in the late afternoon and ate and drank and checked his own hands and feet with the careful inventory of a man assessing damage, and reported that he thought all his fingers and toes were functional, which was the most important news of the day. "The feed store," he said to Eliza. "I know," she said. "When the roof went, the stock—" "I know," she said again. "We'll deal with that when we get out. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting out." He nodded. He had the look of a man who had accepted this and was simply reminding himself of it. The second night was harder, not because anything failed, but because the ventilation shaft became a crisis in the way that problems become crises when you can manage them for long enough that you start to believe you've solved them. She had been pushing the shaft clear every 4 to 5 hours. In the middle of the second night, she guessed it was somewhere around 2 in the morning, she had no clock, only the lamp burn rate and her own body's sense of time. She climbed the ladder and pushed the pole up through the pipe and felt nothing. Not the resistance of snow, not the breakthrough of ice. Nothing. The pole hit solid ice 3 feet above the pipe opening and stopped. She pushed harder. The pole bent slightly under the pressure and did not go through. She came down the ladder. Her face was the wrong color and both men were awake. Rufus first. He had been a light sleeper since his wife died. He had told her that without elaborating, and he looked at her and said, "What?" "The shaft is blocked," she said. "Ice, not just snow. The temperature outside must have dropped sharply in the last few hours." Caleb sat up. "How much air do we have?" "The space is about 400 cubic feet," she said. 3 people, 12 goats. Honestly, we've been burning through the oxygen faster than I initially calculated because I built the math around one person." She paused. "We have time, but not unlimited time." "How much time?" Rufus said. She thought about it honestly. If the shaft stays blocked and nothing changes, 4 to 6 hours before the air quality becomes genuinely dangerous, probably longer before it becomes critical. Caleb looked at Rufus. Rufus was already standing. "I'll go out," Rufus said. "You nearly died coming in," Eliza said. "I know the stakes now." "Sitting there being aware of the stakes doesn't change what that temperature does to a body," she said. "And if you go out and can't come back in, we've lost body heat we can't replace and potentially compromise the door seal." "Then what do you suggest?" Rufus said. "I'm not done yet," Eliza said. She went to the wall where she had stored the second pole, the backup, the one she had cut in advance, and leaned against the wall and told herself was a precaution she probably wouldn't need, 50% belief. And she picked it up and went back to the ladder and climbed it and tried a different angle. The standard push was straight up the center of the pipe. The ice block was apparently not uniform. It had formed unevenly, probably where the pipe opening had a small irregularity in the stone ring around it. And if she could find the edge of the block rather than the center, the ice might be thinner there. She pushed at the 2 o'clock position on the pipe opening. Resistance. She pushed at the 10 o'clock position. More resistance, but different. Not solid core different, layered different, like the ice there had formed in strata rather than as a single mass. She pushed steadily, no sudden force, just consistent pressure at that angle, and she felt the pole working into the layers rather than against them, separating them. And then the top layer gave way and the pole punched through and cold air came down through the pipe in a rush so immediate she could feel it on her upturned face. She held the pole in place and used it to work the opening wider, clearing the ice from the inside edge. And then she came down the ladder with her arms shaking from the sustained overhead pressure, and she sat on the bottom rung and breathed. Rufus was standing right there. "You cleared it," he said. "I cleared it," she said. "The angle. The ice wasn't uniform," she said. "I found the weak layer." He looked at her for a long moment. And then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was eloquent, it wasn't, but because of the way he said it, like a man pulling out a splinter he'd been carrying for a while. "I told the entire settlement that you were digging your own grave," he said. "I said it to anyone who would listen. I said it in Caleb's store. I said it to my ranch hands. I told people not to take you seriously." He paused. "I was wrong about all of it, about the shelter, about the goats, about you. And I want you to know I know that." She looked up at him from the ladder rung. "Okay," she said. "That's all you're going to say?" "What else is there to say? You said you were wrong. I believe you." She got up from the rung and stood up properly. "The air's moving again. We need to keep the shaft clear now on a 2-hour cycle instead of 4. The ice is going to want to reform at that angle." She handed him the pole. He looked at it. You want me to check it? He said. I want you to climb up there in 2 hours and check it, she said. You're taller than me by nearly a foot. The angle will be easier for you. He took the pole. All right, he said. And that was, in the way of practical people in impossible circumstances, how Rufus Kane went from the man who had laughed loudest at Eliza Wren to the man who was now on a 2-hour rotation guarding her ventilation shaft with a sharpened cedar pole. They found their rhythm. Caleb tracked the lamp oil because he was precise about that kind of accounting, and because having a task helped him stay calm, and he reported every 6 hours how many estimated hours of burn time remained. Rufus managed the ventilation shaft and the goat feeding, both done with the wordless competence of someone who wanted to be useful badly enough to learn fast what useful meant in this specific context. Eliza managed everything else: the temperature, the food preparation, the water rationing, the supply math that she ran and reran in her head to find the version of it that came out best. The goats were the constant. 12 living animals in an enclosed space generated, Eliza had calculated when she first built the shelter, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 BTUs of heat per hour collectively. She had been right about this. She had been right about most of the thermal calculations. What she had underestimated was the rate at which the ventilation shaft would ice over in an extreme cold event, and she had partially compensated for that by cutting the backup pole. And the backup pole had worked, and she was sitting here alive because she had cut a cedar pole in advance for a problem she wasn't certain she'd face. Thomas would have told her to cut the pole. She had cut it herself. Different route, same destination. On the morning of the third day, she was fairly sure it was morning. Caleb had called it morning, based on the lamp burn, and she trusted his math. The sound changed. She noticed it first because she had been listening to the non-sound of the storm for 2 days, the absolute silence of earth and stone between her and what was happening above. And she had learned the texture of that silence, the way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. And on the morning of the third day, the silence changed. It was still silence, but it was different silence. She climbed the ladder and pushed the pole up, and it went through the snow crust cleanly, almost easily compared to the past 2 nights. And when she pulled it back and pressed her palm over the pipe opening, she felt cold air, but not moving cold air, not the vibrating knife cold of air being driven sideways by a blizzard. Still air. She looked at the other two. I think it stopped, she said. Rufus stood up. Caleb stood up. She crossed to the door and lifted the iron bar and pushed. The door opened 6 inches and hit a wall of compacted snow. She pushed harder. It gave another few inches. Help me, she said, and Rufus came and put his shoulder against the door beside hers, and they pushed together, and the snow compacted and then gave way in a section that collapsed inward, and suddenly there was daylight in the tunnel entrance, pale and cold and absolutely blinding after 2.5 days of lantern light. All 3 of them stood still for a moment, just looking at it. Then Eliza started digging. She used the pickaxe and Rufus used his hands, and Caleb passed the broken wheelbarrow in from the shelter, and they dug upward through the entrance tunnel and out into the open air. And when Eliza finally stood upright outside for the first time since the storm began, she understood why the silence had changed. The world was completely white and completely still. Not peaceful still, catastrophe still. The stillness of something enormous that has finished doing what it came to do and moved on. The snow was level with the tops of the cedar fence posts she had hammered into the ridge in October to mark the property line, which meant it was somewhere between 4 and 5 feet deep on flat ground, more in the drifts. And the drifts were monumental, built against the south face of the ridge, in shapes that had nothing to do with the ordinary physics of wind and snow, shapes like something had been poured rather than fallen. Rufus came up behind her and stood beside her in the morning light. He looked north toward his property. She did not look at his face. She heard him exhale slowly. The valley below them was unrecognizable. The road to Hollow Flint had disappeared completely. The tree line along the creek was bent at angles that trees didn't survive long term. 3 of the visible outbuildings on the far edge of what she thought was Decker's property had collapsed. She could see the flattened shapes where roof lines used to be. My barns, Rufus said. She didn't answer. I had 3 barns on the north pasture, he said. They were good barns. Solid construction. His voice was doing something careful, something controlled, the way voices get when a person is applying deliberate management to an emotion that would otherwise come out as something raw. 480 head. She looked at him then. His face was doing what she had suspected it would do, which was that Rufus Kane, who was a man who had built something from nothing and who had for 20 years measured his worth in the only currency this part of the frontier understood, land and cattle and the size of the operation you could point to and say, "That's mine, I built that," was standing in the wreckage of that measurement and working through what it meant. "We need to go to Hollow Flint," Eliza said. He looked at her. "There are families down there," she said. "We don't know what the town looks like. We know Caleb's feed store lost its roof. We don't know about the houses. We don't know about food, heat, supplies." "I understand that," he said. I know," she said. "Give yourself a minute." He took the minute, literally. He stood looking north for what Eliza counted as approximately 60 seconds, and then he turned around. "All right," he said. "What do we need to bring?" "The goats," she said. He blinked. "All 12? "All 12, she said. "They're the warmest things we have and they're producing. If families in town are cold and the children need—" She stopped. "Just trust me on this." "I trusted you on the shelter and the ventilation shaft," Rufus said. "I'll trust you on the goats." Getting 12 goats out of an underground shelter through a tunnel dug upward through 4 feet of snow was not an elegant operation. It took 40 minutes and involved a great deal of goat opinion, most of it expressed through the kind of sustained, indignant complaint that goats produce when asked to do something they find objectionable. Stubborn was the last one out, which was perversely appropriate, and she stood at the surface for a moment, looking around with her amber eyes and her broken horn, catching the flat winter light. And then she walked forward into the snow with the specific confidence of an animal that has decided to accept the situation. Caleb emerged behind her, breathing hard from the tunnel climb, and surveyed the landscape. "The road's gone," he said. "We'll go by the ridgeline and come down the south slope," Eliza said. "The south slope will have less drift accumulation, and we can use the goats as windbreaks. Keep them in front and follow their trail." "You want to follow goats down a snow-covered slope?" Caleb said. "They're shorter than us," she said. "They'll find the solid footing faster." Caleb looked at Rufus. Rufus looked at the goats. "She's right," Rufus said. "Let's go." The walk to Hollow Flint took an hour and 40 minutes when it normally took 30. The south slope was better, as Eliza had predicted, the snow 4 feet where it was 5 everywhere else, and the goats moved through it with the four-legged traction of animals whose hooves were designed for rocky, uncertain ground. And Eliza and the 2 men followed in the channels they broke and made slower but steadier progress than they would have alone. They lost the path twice and found it again. Rufus fell once, going into his waist on a drift that looked solid and wasn't, and Caleb and Eliza each took one arm and pulled him out, and he said nothing about it, and they said nothing about it, and they kept walking. The town came into view from the south ridge. It was standing. That was the first thing. It was not rubble. The main street buildings were visible, the structures intact. But as they got closer, the details arrived less kindly. The feed store with its gaping roof, the livery with its south wall staved in. 3 or 4 houses along the east side of the street with visible structural damage, and the thin wisps of smoke rising from the occupied buildings that told her people were burning whatever they had left. The town hall was intact. Smoke rose thick from its chimney. They were heading for the town hall when the door opened and a woman came out. Margaret Ferris, who ran the boarding house and who Eliza knew slightly from her 1 or 2 visits to the settlement. And Margaret looked at the group coming down the main street in the snow, and she looked at the 12 goats trailing behind them, and her face did something complicated that resolved itself into pure, undisguised relief. "We have families inside," Margaret said. 3 families with children. Old man Garrett from the East End, he's not well." She paused. "We've been burning the table legs since this morning." Eliza looked at Rufus. Rufus looked at the goats. "Get the children out here first," Eliza said to Margaret. "Bundle them up and bring them out. I want their hands on these animals in the next 10 minutes. "Their hands?" Margaret started. "Body heat," Eliza said. "The animals are warm. I'll explain the rest inside." She was already walking toward the town hall door, the goats following in their loose herd behind her with Stubborn in the lead, and Rufus Kane was right there beside her. And if anyone in the settlement found it remarkable that the young widow who had dug a hole in the limestone ridge was now arriving at the town hall with 12 goats and the most successful cattle rancher in the valley. Walking at her shoulder like she had his complete attention, They were mostly too cold and too relieved to say so. The town hall opened up around them, warm with the bodies of 3 families and the desperate burning of furniture. And the children came forward with the instinct of cold people toward warm things and pressed their frozen hands into the thick coats of the goats. And Eliza moved among them, telling them what to do and how to do it. And Rufus Kane stood at the door of the town hall, watching her, and did not say anything at all. Caleb came to stand beside him. "She built this," Caleb said quietly. "All of it. The shelter, the calculations, the goats. She figured it out alone with $30 and a broken wheelbarrow." Rufus watched Eliza guide one of the children's hands to Stubborn's warm flank. "I know," he said. "We all laughed at her," Caleb said. Rufus was quiet for a moment. "I know that too," he said. He pushed off from the doorframe and walked into the room and started asking Margaret Ferris what needed doing and what supplies were where and who was in the worst shape. And he listened to the answers and did what he was told, and Eliza across the room noticed this and nodded to herself once, very slightly, and went back to the goats and the children and the serious business of keeping everyone alive through the rest of the day. Outside, the valley lay still and white and devastated under a sky that was, for the first time in 3 days, completely clear. The sun came through the town hall windows cold and brilliant, and the children's hands were warm, and the goats stood patient and steady and alive in the middle of the town hall floor, like they had always planned to be there. And the thermometer that Caleb found on the wall near the front door and checked out of professional habit read 31 degrees outside. Inside, with 15 people and 12 goats generating everything they had, it read 54. Eliza saw the number. She thought, that'll do. She went back to work. 54 degrees through the afternoon. It was not comfortable. Comfortable was a word that had stopped applying to anything in Hollow Flint approximately 3 days ago and would not apply again for some time. But 54 degrees with 15 people and 12 goats in the town hall was survivable. And survivable was the only category that mattered right now, the only benchmark Eliza was measuring against as she moved through the space, taking inventory of what they actually had versus what people believed they had, which were 2 very different lists. Margaret Ferris had been managing the town hall supplies with the competence of a woman who had kept a boarding house running for 9 years, which meant she knew where everything was and had a reasonable sense of how much was left. But her accounting had been built around a shorter crisis than this one. She had planned for 1 bad day, maybe 2. This was going into its 3rd day with no clear sense of what the roads looked like or when supply lines from the eastern settlements might reach them. Eliza asked her for the full count. Margaret went through it with her. Flour, enough for perhaps 4 days at current household consumption rates. Salt, adequate. Coffee, almost gone, which was not a survival issue, but which mattered more than it should have because coffee was the thing people held in both hands and looked at when they needed to believe the situation was manageable. Dried beans, 2 large sacks. Cornmeal, half a sack. Lamp oil, 3 canisters, which was better than Eliza had feared. Firewood, problematic. They had been burning furniture since that morning, and the furniture supply was not infinite. "The chairs are already gone," Margaret said. She said it with the specific flatness of someone who has moved past the point of being upset about individual losses and is now simply reporting facts. "We started on the tables this morning. There's a storage room in the back with some old lumber, but it's green wood. It burns badly and smokes." "Green wood is still wood," Eliza said. "We'll use it when we have to." Old Man Garrett was in the back room on a cot that Margaret had moved there from the boarding house on the first day of the storm, before it became clear that the boarding house itself was going to lose heat faster than the town hall. He was 73, Margaret said, and had a chest condition that had been a problem since last winter, and that the cold was making considerably worse. He was conscious but not well. He needed warmth above everything else. Eliza brought 2 of the goats into the back room and positioned them on either side of the cot. Margaret watched this from the doorway with an expression that was trying to decide between skeptical and desperate. "Body heat," Eliza said without turning around. "Same principle as the shelter. He doesn't need medicine right now. He needs temperature. 2 animals that size on either side of that cot will raise the ambient temperature in this room by 4 to 6 degrees. "You're sure of that?" Margaret said. "I kept a limestone chamber at 53 degrees through a blizzard with 12 of them," Eliza said. "I'm sure of the physics." Margaret looked at the old man and then at the goats. and then at Eliza. She said. Garrett himself had been watching this exchange from the cot, with the alert but exhausted eyes of someone who is sick enough to be past caring about indignity. When the goats settled on either side of him, Stubborn on the left because Stubborn went wherever she decided she was going and there was no point in arguing with her. He put one hand on the nearest one's back and his breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, seemed to settle slightly. Warm, he said. Yes, Eliza said. Strange kind of medicine, he said. It's not medicine, she said. It's just physics. He almost smiled. You're the one who dug the hole in the ridge. Yes. My wife thought you were peculiar, he said. Most people did, Eliza said. She also said you were probably the only person in this settlement who was going to be all right in a bad winter, he said. His voice was thin, but the words were clear. I told her she was being dramatic. She wasn't, Eliza said. No, he agreed. She generally wasn't. He paused. She died in August, so she doesn't get to be right out loud. But I'll know. Eliza looked at him for a moment. There was something in what he said that landed quietly and stayed. Rest, she said. The goats will keep the room warm. She went back to the main hall. The three families were the Marsh family, Eddie's parents and his 4 younger siblings, which explained why Eddie had always been willing to ride out toward the ridge since he was one of 7 people living in a house with thin walls. And the Briggs family from the south end of town, 2 parents and 3 small children, and a widow named Clara Voss who had been living alone in a single-room house on the edge of the settlement and who had made it to the town hall on the first night of the storm by following the sound of the bell that Caleb had rung for 20 minutes straight before the wind took the rope out of his hands. Clara Voss was approximately 60 and had the manner of someone who has seen enough of life to have stopped being surprised by most of it. She was sitting in the corner nearest the stove when Eliza came back from the storage room, and she was watching the children with the goats with an expression that was something between amusement and relief. You know what my first husband would have said about this, Clara said when Eliza came near. What? Eliza said. He would have said a goat in a town hall is a sign of the end times, Clara said. But he also thought electricity was a fad, so I never put much stock in his predictions. Eliza sat down on the bench beside her. She was tired in the way that goes into the bones, not the surface tiredness of a bad night's sleep, but the deep tiredness of sustained high-stakes attention, the kind you don't feel while you're in it, and feel all at once the moment you sit down. You doing all right? Clara asked. Yes, Eliza said. That wasn't convincing. I'm tired, Eliza said, but I'll manage. Clara looked at her steadily. You're 18 years old and you just kept 2 grown men alive in a limestone hole for 3 days during the worst storm anyone in this settlement can remember, and now you're trying to heat a town hall with goats. She paused. You're allowed to be more than tired. Eliza looked at her hands. They were in bad shape. The constant cold and wet and the work on the ventilation shaft had done things to her skin that were going to take weeks to recover from, and the right palm had a deep crack across the pad below her thumb from where she had gripped the pole wrong on the 4th shaft clearing and hadn't noticed until the blood was already there. My husband died 2 months ago, Eliza said. It was the first time she had said it to anyone in Hollow Flint in anything like a direct way. People knew, of course. The settlement was small enough that everyone knew everything, but she had not said it out loud to anyone's face since the funeral that nobody attended. I know, Clara said. Thomas Wren. I heard. I didn't get to... Eliza stopped. She was not going to do this here, not now. She put it back where it had come from. There are things I didn't get to finish saying to him, she said. That's the part that takes the longest, I think. Not the missing. The unfinished sentences. Clara was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said finally. That's exactly right. The unfinished sentences. She looked at her own hands. My first husband and I had an argument the morning he died, about whether to patch the west fence or replace it. I can't tell you what the right answer was about the fence because it doesn't matter. What I can tell you is that 30 years later, I still think about that argument sometimes. They sat together in a silence that was different from any of the silences Eliza had been sitting in for the past weeks. Not the empty silence of the underground chamber, not the careful silence of managing 3 people and 12 goats through a crisis, but the quiet of 2 women sitting together and being honest about hard things. Then Eddie Marsh appeared in front of them, holding one of the smallest Briggs children, a girl of about 3 who had fallen asleep against his shoulder with her hand buried in her coat. "Mrs. Wren," Eddie said, "the little girl was cold, so I was— Is it okay if I just—" "Yes, Eddie," Eliza said. "Sit down and keep her warm. You're doing exactly right." He sat on the bench on the other side of Clara, and the small girl slept on his shoulder, and he looked, for all his 15 years, like someone who had just been handed a responsibility he was going to take more seriously than most things he'd been given in his life. Rufus came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, bringing the cold air in with him in a visible cloud that made the nearest goat turn its head and regard him with displeasure. "Road's still gone," he said to the room in general, "but the snow surface has hardened enough that you can walk on top of it in most places if you're careful about where you step. The drifts are still soft." He was talking to Eliza specifically, she could tell, even though he was addressing the room. "I went about a quarter-mile south. The Briggs house is standing. The Marsh house looks like it lost part of the east roof." Eddie looked up. "Our house?" "East section," Rufus said, and his voice was careful, the voice of a man who had recently learned something about what it felt like to hear bad news about your property. "The main room looks intact. The lean-to on the east side is gone." Eddie nodded. His jaw did something tight and then released. "My father built that lean-to," he said. "I know," Rufus said. "It took him 2 summers." "We'll rebuild it," Rufus said. He said it simply, without the performance of comfort in it, just a statement of what he believed would happen. "When the thaw comes, we'll rebuild it. I'll bring men." Eddie looked at him. This was Rufus Kane making a commitment to a boy whose family had, at best, been the kind of people Rufus Kane had never had occasion to notice before today. Eddie seemed to understand that and seemed not entirely sure what to do with it. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," he said. Rufus nodded and went to the stove to warm his hands. Caleb had been doing what Caleb did, which was to count things. He came to Eliza with his usual directness. "The firewood situation is going to be a problem by tomorrow morning," he said. "The green lumber in the back will burn but slowly, and it'll smoke. The stove draft isn't good enough to handle heavy smoke safely inside this building with this many people." "Can we use the stove in the boarding house?" Eliza asked. "The boarding house stove is larger," Caleb said, "but moving people through the cold to get there, to the children, Garrett, not moving everyone," Eliza said. "Using it as a secondary heat source. Run it continuously with the green wood and let it warm the walls shared between the buildings." She thought about it. "Does the boarding house share a wall with the town hall?" "South wall," Caleb said. "Then get the green wood burning in the boarding house stove and bank it slow and let it run all night. The shared wall will conduct enough to matter." Caleb looked at her with his precise expression. "That'll work," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "You're very sure of yourself." "I'm sure of the physics," she said. "The rest I'm guessing at like everyone else." The afternoon moved forward in the way that crisis afternoons move, which is to say that it was simultaneously very long and very compressed, each hour full of small decisions that each felt larger than they probably were, because the margin for error was smaller than it normally was, and everyone knew it. Eliza milked the 3 producing does in the corner of the town hall, while the children watched with varying degrees of fascination, and one of the Briggs boys, who was about 8 and had the specific audacity of that age, asked her 17 questions without pausing between them, including how goats decided when to produce milk, whether goat milk tasted the same as cow milk, whether Eliza had named all of them, and what the broken-horned one was called. "Stubborn," Eliza told him. "Why?" "Because she does whatever she wants, regardless of what I prefer." He looked at Stubborn, who was standing directly in the way of 2 adults trying to pass each other near the door, seemingly on purpose. "I like her," he said. "Most people do," Eliza said, "which is also why she keeps doing it." She gave the milk to Margaret and told her to heat it and give the children the first servings and the elderly Garrett the next, and everyone else after, and she went to see about the green wood and the boarding house stove. Rufus was already in the boarding house when she got there. He had not been told to go there. He had figured out what needed doing and gone and done it, which was, she was learning, what Rufus Kane did when he stopped being the man who laughed at things and became the man he apparently was underneath that. He had found the green lumber and had split some of the smaller pieces into manageable sections and was loading the boarding house stove when she came in. "Caleb's idea?" he asked without looking up. Mine, she said. But Caleb did the geometry on the shared wall. Makes sense, he said. He pushed another piece into the stove. The smoke came back at first, the wet wood resisting, and then the existing fire caught it and drew it up and the draft took hold. How long before it makes a difference to the town hall side? An hour, maybe 2, she said. It won't be dramatic, a few degrees. A few degrees matters. Yes, she said. A few degrees always matters. He was quiet for a moment, tending the stove. Then, I've been thinking about the cattle. She waited. I'll lose most of them, he said. I don't know the exact number. I won't know until I can get out to the north pasture and count what's left standing, but I know it's most of them. He said this with the steadiness of a man who has had the conversation with himself already, has grieved the thing enough to be able to say it plainly. I built that herd over 20 years. My wife and I, we built it together, the first half. The second half I built after she was gone. He paused. And now I'm going to have to start again. You still have the land, Eliza said. Yes. And the barns? Some of them. You don't know yet. Some of them, he agreed. And you know how to do it, she said. Starting from nothing is harder. Starting from less is just math. He looked at her. Is that what it felt like to you when the bank came? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. It felt like the end of something. For about a week it felt like the end. She looked at the stove. But I had the land. And I had the pickaxe. And I knew how to do the next thing. The next thing being digging a hole in a limestone ridge with a borrowed pickaxe. The next thing being the most logical next thing available to me, she said. Holes in limestone ridges are just what it looked like in my specific situation. He was quiet for a moment. The stove was taking the green wood now, the draft established, the smoke going where it was supposed to go. I want to propose something, he said. She looked at him. When the thaw comes and I can assess what's left, he said, I want to have a conversation with the town council about the things you built, the shelter, the ventilation system, the methods. He paused. This settlement almost didn't survive this storm. It should have been better prepared. You were better prepared than anyone. I was prepared for me, she said. 1 person, 12 goats, a ridge full of limestone. The principle is the same, he said. You figured out something that works. The town needs to know it works. He turned from the stove to face her fully. And I want to be the one who tells them I was wrong about you, publicly, in front of the council. Eliza looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. I want to. She considered this for a moment. The boarding house was cold but warmer than outside, and the stove was beginning to make a real difference in the immediate area around it, and somewhere through the wall, Stubborn was probably annoying someone. All right, she said. They went back to the town hall. The second night in the town hall was hard in the specific way that second nights are always harder than first nights, because the first night runs on adrenaline and the second night runs on nothing but actual endurance. The children were tired and fractious. Old Garrett's breathing had improved with the goat warmth, but he was not well, and everyone in the back room knew it. The green wood in the boarding house was doing what Eliza had predicted. Slowly, incrementally, undramatically making the shared wall useful. And the town hall was holding at 48 degrees by midnight, which was not comfortable but was above the threshold where the smallest children would be in danger. Eliza slept for 3 hours and woke and checked the building and the stove and the animals and slept for 2 more. She dreamed about Thomas, not about losing him. Those dreams had been the October dreams, vivid and exhausting, but about building something with him, the 2 of them on the ridge, him measuring and her calculating, and both of them arguing about the angle of the ventilation shaft. And it was the kind of dream that was just ordinary enough to feel like a memory. And she woke from it at dawn with the specific hollowness of someone who had been somewhere that doesn't exist and had to return. She lay still for a moment. Then Stubborn put her face directly against Eliza's and breathed on her with the complete absence of subtlety that was Stubborn's primary mode of communication. All right, Eliza said. She got up. The third morning in the town hall was different. The difference came from the sky. The sky had changed overnight from the flat uniform white of storm aftermath to something with actual dimension in it, clouds moving rather than sitting, and the light coming through the town hall's small eastern windows had the quality of real morning light rather than the diffused gray they had been living in for 4 days. People noticed. The children noticed first, the way children always notice when the quality of light changes, and the noticing spread through the room quickly, the specific lift that comes when the weather shifts from enemy to neutral. Rufus had been up before Eliza. She found him outside with one of the younger Marsh children, a boy of about 10 named Samuel, who had apparently attached himself to Rufus at some point the previous evening and had not detached since, scooping snow away from the town hall entrance. "Samuel," Rufus was saying, "if you dig straight down like that, you'll create a hole people fall into. You want to move it laterally. See? Push it sideways so the path clears." Samuel tried it and made a face. "That's harder." "Most things that work are," Rufus said. He looked up and saw Eliza, and there was something uncomplicated in his face in that moment. Just a man who had spent the night in a crisis and was now doing the next useful thing, and was glad to see another person who would also do the next useful thing. "Roads are better," he said. "I went a half-mile east at first light. The main drift has a crust on it now. Horses could probably manage it." "The eastern settlements will send people when they can," Eliza said. "Probably today," Rufus said. "They'll have seen the storm. They'll know Hollow Flint took the worst of it." "We need to know who in the settlement is still home and needs help before anyone comes," she said. "There could be people who didn't make it to the town hall." Rufus looked at her. "I'll go." "I'll come with you," she said. "You've been awake most of 3 days." "So have you." He didn't argue further. He handed Samuel the snow shovel and told him to keep the path clear with the lateral technique, and they went. What they found in the next 2 hours would take longer than 2 hours to process. The settlement was 14 households spread across a half-mile radius from the town hall, and they went to each one. Most were standing. 3 had lost roof sections and been abandoned. 1, a small house on the northwest edge that belonged to a young couple named Pierce, who had arrived in Hollow Flint that past summer, had its front wall partially collapsed inward. They dug through the snow to the Pierce house door and knocked and heard nothing, and Rufus hit the door with his shoulder and it opened, and they found the Pierces in the back room, both alive, in bed with every blanket and piece of clothing they owned piled on top of them, and the temperature in the room somewhere below freezing. The wife, a young woman who could not have been more than 20, had a frostbitten right hand from some task she had needed to do in the night without gloves. Getting them out and to the town hall took 40 minutes, and both Rufus's arms and most of Eliza's remaining upper body strength, because the husband had not been able to keep enough body temperature to walk well and had to be supported. When they finally got through the town hall door with the Pierces, Margaret Ferris made a sound that was not quite a word, and immediately started on the frostbitten hand with warm water and cloth, and the specific competence of a woman who has managed emergencies long enough to skip the reaction and go straight to the response. Eliza sat down on the bench inside the door, just for a minute. Clara Voss appeared beside her with a cup of hot goat milk that was more goat milk in her life than she had expected to be consuming by 60, as she mentioned, but she had done stranger things. Eliza drank it. The hall was louder now than it had been. More people, the Pierces' arrival, the children who had been given a task by Rufus and were taking it seriously, the ongoing sounds of the goats, who had now thoroughly ceased to be remarkable to anyone in the building and were simply part of the furniture. Rufus came to sit beside her. He did not speak for a moment, just sat. 4 households have significant damage, he said finally. 3 families need somewhere to stay until repairs are done. The Marsh House East section is gone. He rubbed the back of his neck. I'm going to offer the use of 2 rooms at my place while we rebuild. It's not much, but it's a lot, Eliza said. He shrugged, not dismissing it, just redistributing it. She looked at the room, at the children pressed against the goats, at Clara Voss dispensing goat milk with the confidence of someone running a medical operation. At Caleb by the stove, still accounting for everything, the man who had kept the ledger on her grain bill without judgment and who had rung a bell in a blizzard for 20 minutes until the rope was taken from his hands. At Eddie Marsh, who was 17 and was holding a sleeping 3-year-old and taking it seriously. At Margaret Ferris, who had burned the chairs and then the tables and had not lost a single person. At old Garrett in the back room, who was breathing better and who was keeping his hand on Stubborn's back like it was an anchor. This town, Eliza said. What about it? Rufus said. It's not. I thought it was just people who laughed, she said. I thought it was just. The Rufus Canes and the people who watched. She paused. But it's Caleb ringing the bell. It's Margaret and the chairs. It's Eddie and the little girl. She stopped. It's more than I thought it was. Rufus was quiet for a moment. You might be the only one here who has a reason to think well of us, he said, after what we did. What you did was not believe something that was hard to believe, she said. That's different from what you did after. She looked at him. What you did after is what matters now. He looked at his hands, the hands that had spent the morning helping dig out a collapsed wall and carry a half-frozen man through the snow. I've been a fool for most of my adult life, he said, without drama, just observation. You've been a man who was successful at one thing for a long time and assumed that meant you understood everything else, Eliza said. That's pretty common. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, she said. It's just accurate. He let out a breath that was most of a laugh. And then the sound came from outside. The sound of horses, more than one, and voices carrying over the snow. And Samuel burst in through the door shouting that there were riders coming from the east. And the whole room shifted, the particular shift of people who have been holding their breath for 4 days and are now, maybe, allowed to exhale. Eliza did not move from the bench immediately. She sat and listened to the room change around her, the voices rising, Margaret going to the door, Rufus already on his feet. And she felt the exhaustion that she had been keeping at a distance settle into her properly for the first time, sitting heavy in her shoulders and the backs of her legs and the place behind her eyes. The riders from the eastern settlements brought food and blankets and a man who called himself a doctor, which in this part of the frontier meant a man who had read more medical books than anyone else available and had the practical experience to compensate for what the books didn't cover. He went directly to Garrett and to the Pierce woman's hand and did what he could do. He also looked around the town hall at the goats and the children and the thermometer and the general organized chaos of it, and he said to no one in particular, "Who set this up?" Caleb, from across the room, pointed at Eliza. The doctor looked at her. She was still on the bench, still holding the empty cup, still doing the math in her head that she would probably never fully stop doing, the constant background calculation of temperature and supply and probability. "You kept these people alive," he said. Not a question. "The goats kept the temperature," she said. "The people kept themselves alive." "That's not what I heard," the doctor said. She looked at Caleb, who had the expression of a man who had been talking. "I just did the next thing," she said. The doctor looked at her for a moment longer and then went back to his patients, and Eliza put the cup down on the bench beside her and thought about the next thing, which was figuring out how many people in Hollow Flint still needed help that hadn't been counted yet, and what the food supply looked like now that the Eastern riders had brought more, and whether old Garrett was well enough to be moved back to the boarding house, and what the ventilation shaft at the Ridge shelter needed to keep it functional through the rest of winter. There was a lot of next things. She stood up. Stubborn appeared at her left knee. It was becoming a habit, the goat and the knee. And Eliza put her hand on Stubborn's head without looking down and walked toward Caleb to get the updated supply count. Behind her, the town hall was loud with new voices and the sounds of people who were going to be all right. The doctor had someone make a note in the township record that day, a formal entry in the kind of ledger that small frontier settlements kept for posterity. Not because anyone thought posterity would particularly care, but because the habit of recording things was how communities kept track of what they had been through and how they had survived it. The entry read, in the clerk's careful hand, Hollow Flint, November 1895. Blizzard event. Settlement sustained significant structural damage across multiple properties. No fatalities recorded. Community gathered at Town Hall under the direction of E. Wren, who provided shelter, heat, and sustenance through the duration of the storm. Nobody had told the clerk to write E. Wren. He had heard the name enough times in one day that it had simply gone into his hand the way things go when they become the obvious answer to whatever question you're asking. Eliza never saw the entry. She was outside by then, heading back up the ridge road with 12 goats and the particular clarity that comes after sustained crisis. When your body finally accepts that the immediate emergency is over and begins the slow process of returning to whatever ordinary means now. The ridge road was difficult but passable. She went up it 1 foot in front of the other, and the goats went with her, and the sky above the valley was the hard, clear blue of winter aftermath, and below her hollow. Flint was a cluster of smoke columns and damaged roof lines and people moving through the snow toward each other with the specific purposefulness of people who have something to do and know that doing it matters. She did not look back. She had the ridge to get back to. And the goats needed feeding. The goats needed feeding, and the ridge needed tending, and Eliza had not properly slept in 4 days. And these three facts occupied her completely for the first week after the storm, in a way that she was quietly grateful for because occupation was easier than the alternative, which was sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The shelter had held. She walked through it on that first afternoon back, checking each cedar post, running her hand along the limestone ceiling, looking at the ventilation shaft that had nearly sealed on the second night, and had not, because she had found the weak layer in the ice, and pushed through it with the cedar pole she had cut in advance for exactly that possibility. Everything was intact. The floor had some moisture at the north corner where the temperature differential had caused condensation during the storm's worst period, but the structure itself was solid, exactly as the geology said it would be, exactly as she had calculated. She sat on the floor in the middle of the shelter for a long time. The goats settled around her the way they always did at this hour, the end-of-day settling when the herd's collective energy dropped and they found their positions and stayed there. Stubborn put her head on Eliza's knee. The lantern was burning low and she should trim it, and she didn't yet, just sat in the orange light with 12 warm animals and the stillness of 6 feet of earth above her and let herself be still for the first time in days. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him specifically and practically, the way she had been trying to think about him since October. Not the absence of him, which was too large to think about directly, but the particular things. The way he had held a hammer, slightly too high on the handle because he said it gave him more control even though it didn't. The specific coffee he had preferred, too strong and too hot, the kind that left a ring on whatever it sat on. The fact that he had been afraid of heights and had never told her for the first 3 months they were together, and she had figured it out herself when they climbed the ridge to look at the land, and he had gone very quiet and very still at the top. She had not said anything about it then. She wished she had. She wished she had said, "I see this, it's all right, you don't have to pretend." She hadn't, because she was 18 and had not yet learned that seeing something and saying you see it are two different acts and both of them matter. She had a lot of things she wished she had said. That, she thought, was probably just what grief was. A list of unfinished sentences that got shorter over time but never reached zero. Stubborn pressed her head more firmly against Eliza's knee. "All right," Eliza said, to the goat, to the shelter, to the unremarkable limestone walls that had kept everyone alive. "All right." She trimmed the lantern and went to sleep. Spring did not arrive kindly. It arrived the way springs arrive after catastrophic winters, reluctantly, in stages, the snow retreating and then returning and then retreating again in a 2 steps forward, 1 step back negotiation with a season that didn't want to let go. February brought a thaw that lasted 10 days and raised everyone's hopes, and then a hard freeze in early March that crushed them again. And the combination of melt and refreeze created ice conditions on the roads that were in some ways more dangerous than the original snow. But things were moving. The Eastern supply caravans had been coming through Hollow Flint regularly since the week after the storm, and the food situation had stabilized by December, and the structural repairs had started as soon as the weather allowed any outdoor work, which in this case meant the second week of February when the thaw gave enough dry days to put men on damaged roofs. Rufus Kane was one of those men. He was not the kind of man who typically climbed onto other people's roofs. He was the kind of man who paid other people to do it. But he had gone to the north pasture in the first week of December and counted what was left of his herd, 87 head out of 480, and the arithmetic of that had done something to him that no external force could have done, which was to make him genuinely uncertain for the first time in 20 years about who he was and what that meant about what he should do next. 87 cattle, 87 out of 480. He had stood in the north pasture in the December cold and looked at the shapes under the snow that were not cattle shapes, that were not any shapes he wanted to give names to, and he had stayed out there longer than was sensible or safe, long enough that the cold started to find the places his coat didn't reach. And he had thought about Eliza standing on the ridge road in October telling him that if those cattle were in open pasture when this storm came, he wouldn't lose a handful, he'd lose most of them. She had been right, he had been wrong. and the full cost of being wrong was distributed across the north pasture in shapes under the snow, and there was absolutely nothing to be done about it now except rebuild and do differently next time. He went to the Marsh house first. He brought 2 men from his remaining ranch operation and enough lumber to rebuild the east section, and they did it over 3 days in the February thaw, with Samuel Marsh handing up boards from below and Eddie Marsh working beside Rufus's men with the determined competence of someone who has decided that his family's house is not going to stay broken if he has anything to say about it. Rufus worked alongside them, not supervising, working. At the end of the first day, Eddie said to him, "You don't have to do this, Mr. Kane." "I told you I would," Rufus said. "I know, but your cattle and the rebuilding and the—" "Eddie," Rufus said, in the voice of a man who has thought about this more than he wants to admit, "I had 480 cattle, because people helped me get started 20 years ago when I had nothing. A man named Garrett Sr. lent me the capital for my first breeding stock. Your grandfather helped me dig the first well on the north pasture." He set a board in place and checked the angle. "That's how this works. Or that's how it's supposed to work." Eddie was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather never mentioned that," he said. "He probably wouldn't," Rufus said. "That kind of man doesn't." Eliza came down from the ridge on a Wednesday in late February to find Rufus Kane standing on her property. Not aggressively. Not with the energy of the man on the ridge road in October. He was standing near the shelter entrance with his hat in his hands and the specific posture of a man who is waiting for someone and is not sure of his welcome. She pulled up the mule. She had bought the mule back from the neighbor in December, a transaction that had taken most of her remaining funds, but that she had decided was necessary, and looked at him. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I didn't think you were," she said. "What do you need?" He turned his hat in his hands once. It was a gesture she had not seen him make before. It was the gesture of a man who is about to say something he has not entirely rehearsed. "The town council wants to commission a community storm shelter," he said. "Underground, large enough for the whole settlement. They want it built before next winter." "I heard," she said. She climbed down from the mule. "Margaret mentioned it." "They don't know how to build it," he said. "The right depth, the ventilation, the structural supports. They've been talking about it since December, and they've been going in circles because nobody who has any authority in this settlement has built anything like it." "I know," she said. "They want to ask you to supervise the project," he said. "I told them I'd ask first because—" He stopped. "Because the last time this settlement had a request for you, it was about how far away from town you could stay." Eliza looked at him. "The town council is asking me," she said. "Yes." "The same council that didn't notice I existed until November." "Yes," he said. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds accurate," she said. He nodded. She tied the mule to the post she had driven into the ground in November for that purpose, and walked past Rufus to the shelter entrance and checked the ventilation shaft out of habit, the way she always checked it when she returned from anywhere. And it was clear and the stones around it were dry, and the iron pipe was exactly where it should be. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. "I'll do it," she said. She heard him exhale. "On conditions," she said. "Name them," he said. "I design it," she said, turning around. "Not suggestions, not committee decisions about depth and materials. I design it based on what I know works, and the construction follows my specifications." "Agreed," he said. "And I want 2 things from the council formally acknowledged," she said. 1, they fund the project properly. Not the bare minimum. Proper cedar for the ceiling supports, iron fittings for the ventilation shafts, and adequate food storage capacity for the entire settlement for 2 weeks. "I'll back that personally," Rufus said. "What's the second thing?" She looked at him steadily. "The project record names the designer, not as a footnote, as the person responsible for the work." He looked at her. He understood what she was asking and why she was asking it, and she could see him understanding it and deciding that understanding it was enough. "Done," he said. The first community meeting about the shelter project was held at the town hall in early March, and Eliza stood in front of the settlement that had spent October and most of November, either laughing at her or not noticing her. And she explained the geology of limestone ridge construction and the thermal physics of earth insulation and the mathematics of ventilation shaft diameter, relative to occupancy capacity, and she did it without preamble or apology, the way you explain something when you know it, and the people you're explaining it to need to know it too." Nobody laughed. Clara Voss was in the front row taking notes in a small book she had brought without being asked, because Clara had decided that someone should write this down and she had appointed herself. Old Garrett was there too, recovered enough to sit upright in the hard chair near the door, his breathing still ragged at the edges, but his eyes sharp and present. Margaret Ferris sat beside him, not because he needed looking after, but because they had developed in December the particular friendship of two people who had spent a difficult period in close proximity and discovered that they preferred each other's company to the alternative. Eddie Marsh was in the back, Samuel beside him, their father in the middle row with his hat on his knee. Caleb Morrow sat near the front with a pad of his own, doing the supply cost calculations in real time as Eliza spoke, which was Caleb being Caleb, which was to say that Caleb's version of full attention was to immediately make the numbers work. Rufus Kane stood against the back wall. He did not speak during the meeting. He had been very deliberate about this, Eliza had noticed, about not being the person whose voice shaped the room the way it always had. He was present, he was paying attention, but the space he had always occupied automatically, he was now leaving empty, and the room was filling it with other voices, which was the point. She answered questions for 2 hours. Real questions, specific ones. How far from the ridge could they build and still get adequate limestone coverage? Whether the ventilation ratio she was proposing had been tested at the scale she was recommending. What happened if the ventilation shaft iced over in a storm of the same severity as November? For that last one, she paused. "It will ice over," she said. "I want to be direct about that. Any ventilation shaft in an extreme cold event will ice over if you're not actively maintaining it. The system I'm designing has 3 shafts instead of 1, larger diameter, with manual clearing access from inside. But somebody has to be in there during a bad storm clearing those shafts on rotation." The room was quiet for a moment. 2-hour intervals, she said. "In a serious storm, that's the requirement. You need to plan for who does that job." A man named Briggs, the father, from the town hall, said, "How do you know when it needs clearing?" "You check it on schedule," she said. "You don't wait to know, you check before you need to." She looked at the room when she said it, and most of them looked back, and she thought that was probably the most important thing she had said in 2 hours of specifications and calculations, and it was also the simplest, and she left it there. Construction started in April, when the ground thawed enough to work properly. It was not, as it turned out, an elegant process. The first excavation crew hit a shelf of harder limestone at 8 feet that they hadn't detected in the surface survey, and it took 3 additional days and different equipment borrowed from a quarrying operation 40 miles east to break through it. The first set of cedar posts were cut too green and had to be replaced because Eliza looked at them and said they would shrink wrong as they dried and the fit would be wrong and she would not sign off on them. The iron fittings for the ventilation shafts came from the eastern supply in the wrong gauge, and Caleb had to write 3 letters before the correct specification arrived. None of this surprised Eliza. Building things the right way in difficult conditions with imperfect materials was just what building things was. The plans were correct. The materials were the part you negotiated with. She was on site every day, it was workable. She brought Stubborn, because Stubborn had started following her on the mule trips down the ridge, and had made her feelings about being left behind sufficiently clear that it was easier to bring her. Stubborn became a fixture of the construction site in a way that nobody planned and nobody particularly objected to. She ate the lunch scraps that fell. She stood in the way of wheelbarrows with the serene confidence of an animal who was never once worried about whether she was welcome, and she pressed her forehead against the knee of anyone who stood still long enough. Samuel Marsh was present most days, officially as the water carrier for the crew, but actually as someone who was learning everything he could about how the structure was being built, asking Eliza questions with the same unbroken intensity the Briggs boy had used about the goats in the town hall. "Why 3 shafts?" he asked one afternoon. "Because 1 shaft is a single point of failure," she said. "And 2? 2 is better. But if 1 fails, you're running the whole system on half capacity while you clear the blocked one," she said. 3 means if 1 blocks, you still have full functional capacity while you fix it. He thought about this. "What about 4? "Diminishing returns after 3, she said. "You start spending more on ventilation infrastructure than the marginal improvement justifies." He nodded slowly, working through it. He was 12 now, turned 12 in February, and he had the kind of mind that processed things structurally, wanted to understand the reasoning, not just the result. "How did you figure all this out?" he asked. She looked at the construction site, the men working in the excavation, the cedar posts waiting, Caleb at the edge checking specifications against his ledger. "I had a problem," she said. "I had no money and no lumber and a winter coming, so I thought about what I did have." "Limestone," he said. 40 acres of it," she said, "which most people thought was worthless. But you didn't." "I thought about what limestone actually does," she said, "not what people said it was good for. What it actually does." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the excavation. "Is that what you'd tell me to do?" he said, "with a problem? Think about what things actually do instead of what people say they are?" She looked at him. "That's not bad advice," she said. "Yes." The community shelter was finished in late September, 3 weeks before the first hard frost of 1896. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. It was 60 feet of underground chamber with 3 ventilation shafts and cedar-reinforced ceilings, and a food storage alcove with enough capacity for the whole settlement for 2 weeks, and a thermometer mounted on every wall, because Eliza had been very specific about the thermometers. The night it was finished, Rufus Kane called a meeting at the town hall. Eliza came down from the ridge because he had asked her specifically, and because she was curious what he intended to do with a meeting. He stood in front of the settlement, the same room where Eliza had given the specifications presentation in March, the same room where she had told them about the ventilation shaft rotation schedule. And he talked for about 10 minutes without notes. He said that he had spent 20 years in Hollow Flint and had considered himself a person who understood the place and its people. He said that he had been wrong about that in a specific way that he wanted to name directly, which was that he had confused being successful with being right, and those were not the same thing, and the difference had almost cost this settlement everything in November. He said that he had called a young widow digging a shelter into a limestone ridge a fool in public, and that he had been wrong, and that the public nature of being wrong meant the correction needed to be equally public. He said that the community shelter that would keep every person in Hollow Flint alive in the next serious storm had been designed and built under the supervision of Eliza Wren, who had understood something about this land and this climate that he had not, and that the settlement owed her a debt that could not be fully settled but could at least be properly acknowledged. Then he sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Clara Voss started clapping first because Clara did not wait for someone else to go first as a general rule. The room followed. It was not a dramatic sound, Bureau. There were not that many people in Hollow Flint, but it was the particular sound of people who mean it, and there is a difference between that and the other kind. Eliza sat in her chair and did not stand up and did not make a speech because she had not prepared one, and because she was not, at the base of it, a woman who had done what she had done in order to be acknowledged for it. She had done it because the alternative was dying, and then because the alternative was other people dying, and then because it was the right next thing, and after that the next right thing, and the logic of it had always been internal, had always been between her and the problem in front of her, and whatever tools were available. But she was glad she was there. That surprised her a little. She had expected the acknowledgement to feel like less, to feel thin or procedural after the actual substance of the year she had been through. But sitting in the town hall with the settlement around her and Stubborn's head almost certainly going to appear against her knee, the moment she sat still long enough, she found that it did not feel thin. It felt like something had been completed, not Thomas. That was not complete and would not be, not the way things complete neatly. The unfinished sentences were still there, would probably always be there, and she had arrived at a kind of peace with that which was not the same as resolution, but was functional, was livable. But something else had completed. Something about the year and what it had required and whether it had been worth it, whether the limestone ridge and the pickaxe and the 12 unwanted goats and the calculation about body heat and the cedar poles and the ventilation shaft she had pushed through with both arms shaking, whether all of it had added up to something that mattered beyond her own survival. Caleb appeared at her elbow. "Your grain bill," he said. She looked at him. He held out a piece of paper. It was the ledger page with her account on it, the grain, the cornmeal, the various small credits she had run up since October. At the bottom, in his precise clerk's handwriting, was a single word, settled. "The council voted last week," he said, "retroactive payment for the design and supervision work. I applied it to the account and the remainder is in your name at the territorial savings." He paused. "It's not a large amount, but it's yours clean." She looked at the paper for a long time. You didn't have to do that, she said. The council did it, he said. I just did the accounting. She looked at him and he looked back at her with his precise, direct expression that she had come to understand was not coldness, but its own kind of honesty, a man who communicated through accuracy rather than warmth, and who was, in his way, one of the most trustworthy people she had encountered. Thank you, she said, for the grain in October, for ringing the bell, for all of it. He nodded once. You paid it back in milk, he said. As promised. Winter came again. It came more gently than the year before, or perhaps Hollow Flint was simply more prepared to receive it, which amounted to the same thing from a practical standpoint. The community shelter was stocked, and the ventilation shaft rotation schedule was posted on the town hall door with the name of the volunteer assigned to each shift and the intervals marked clearly. 3 families had built their own ridge-side storage shelters based on Eliza's methods, dug into the hillside south of the settlement, with cedar posts and iron ventilation pipes and thermometers on the walls. Samuel Marsh's family was one of them. Samuel had built a significant portion of it himself, under his father's supervision and with Eddie's help, and when he showed it to Eliza in October, he stood in the entrance with the proprietary pride of someone who has made a thing with their hands that works the way it's supposed to work. The angle on the east ventilation shaft, he said. I went with the 2-degree correction you mentioned, for the ice accumulation tendency. She stepped inside and checked the shaft and the ceiling posts and the floor pack. It's good work, she said. I use cedar from the south slope, he said. Same as you did. I know, she said. I can tell by the grain. He grinned. I was 12 years old, and he had built a shelter that would keep his family alive through a bad winter, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was visible in every part of him. Eliza went back up to her own ridge. The goat herd was 23 now. The births in spring had more than compensated for the ones she had lost to old age over the summer, and she had sold 4 does to a family east of the settlement who wanted to start their own dairy operation and had used the money to properly shore up the south wall of the shelter, which she had always thought was the weakest section. She had planted a garden on the south-facing slope in spring, the kind of south exposure that captured the most available winter light, and it had produced well enough through the summer that her food stores were in better shape than they had ever been. She stood at the shelter entrance in the October evening and looked out over the valley. Hollow Flint was down there in the early dark, smoke rising from the chimneys, the new roof on Caleb's feed store visible even from the ridge, the Marsh House East section solid and complete. The town hall was lit from inside, some meeting in progress, some piece of ordinary settlement business being conducted in the ordinary way. The wind was coming from the north. She turned and faced into it the way she had turned and faced into it a year ago, standing on this same slope, and felt it on her face and assessed it the way she assessed wind now, which was not with fear, but with the specific attention of someone who respects what they're dealing with. It was cold. It would get colder. She turned back and went inside. The shelter was 55 degrees. The goats were settling. Stubborn was already pressed against Eliza's leg before she had properly sat down, which was not unusual, but which she had also stopped pretending not to appreciate. She thought about the year, about what it had cost and what it had built, about Thomas, the way she always would, but steadily now, the grief doing what grief does when you feed it properly and don't try to starve it or drown it. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. She thought about Samuel building his family's shelter with cedar from the south slope, about Clara Voss in the front row writing things down, about Garrett's hand on Stubborn's back in the back room, the anchor of it, about Rufus Kane on a roof he didn't need to be on, doing work he didn't need to do, because the debts he was most serious about paying were not the financial ones. She thought about the things she had understood that everyone else had not, back in October with a pickaxe and a broken wheelbarrow, and $31 and a piece of rocky limestone land that nobody wanted. She had not understood it because she was special. She had understood it because she had been paying attention to what was actually true rather than what was comfortable to believe. The earth held temperature. Goats generated heat. 3 ventilation shafts were more reliable than 1. These were not insights. They were just the facts of the situation, available to anyone who looked at them directly. The problem, she had come to think, was that most people looked at the situation they expected to face and prepared for that. She had looked at the situation that was actually coming, the worst version, the one nobody wanted to plan for because planning for it meant admitting it was possible. and she had built for that one instead. You didn't get to choose which winter arrived. You only got to choose what you had built before it came. Outside, the north wind crossed the ridge and moved on south toward the valley, and Hollow Flint sat below in its lights and its smoke, imperfect and damaged and repaired and more prepared than it had been, learning what the land had been trying to teach it for years, which was that preparation was not pessimism, it was just arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not change because you preferred a different answer. The thermometer read 55. Eliza pulled her coat around her shoulders and sat in the warmth of her own making, in the home she had dug from the earth with her own hands, and the winter wind outside found no purchase in the limestone and moved on, and the shelter held, and that was enough. That had always been enough. It was enough now.